Margaret Greene's gaunt face stared back at her from the cracked mirror, her once vibrant green eyes now hollow and tired from months of near starvation. The year was 1878, and Whispering Pines, Colorado, had not been kind to a widow, with nothing but dreams and debts. The dust settled on the windowsill of her small, dilapidated cabin as she traced the sharp angles of her collarbone with trembling fingers. 3 days since her last meal, a handful of beans and a crust of bread from Mrs. Wilkins's charity. Pride was a luxury Margaret could no longer afford, not after her husband Thomas had died in that mining accident 6 months ago, leaving her with nothing but a mountain of debts and empty promises. A knock at the door startled her from her reflection. She quickly smoothed down her threadbare dress, pinching her cheeks to bring some color to her pale face before opening the door. "Miss Greene." Mason Reid stood on her porch, his broad shoulders blocking the harsh midday sun. His Stetson was clutched in his hands, revealing sun-bleached brown hair and a face weathered by years under the open sky. "Mr. Reid," Margaret acknowledged with a nod, unconsciously standing taller despite the weakness in her limbs. "What brings you here?" Mason shifted uncomfortably, his eyes briefly taking in her thin frame before meeting her gaze. "I heard about your situation, madam. Thought I might be of some help." Margaret bristled. "I don't need charity, Mr. Reid." A small smile played at the corner of his lips. "Not offering charity, Miss Greene. Offering a business proposition." This caught her attention. "I'm listening." "Your husband's land, it's good grazing territory. I've been looking to expand my herd." Mason gestured vaguely to the east where his ranch lay. "I'd be willing to buy it at a fair price." Margaret's heart sank. The land was all she had left. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Reid, but I can't sell. Not yet." Something flickered in Mason's eyes. Respect, perhaps. "Then maybe we can come to another arrangement. I need help at my ranch. Mrs. Potts, my housekeeper, is getting on in years and could use an extra pair of hands." Pride warred with necessity in Margaret's mind. "I don't know anything about housekeeping on a ranch, Mr. Reid." "You'll learn," he said simply. "It pays well enough and includes meals." At the mention of meals, Margaret's empty stomach clenched painfully. Still, she hesitated. Mason seemed to sense her reluctance. "Think about it, Miss Greene. My door's open when you're ready." He placed his hat back on his head, tipped it politely, and turned to leave. "Mr. Reid," Margaret called after him, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "When would I start?" He turned back, his expression carefully neutral. "Tomorrow morning, if that suits you." It wasn't just hunger that made her nod. It was something in his eyes, a sincerity, a respect that didn't make her feel like a charity case. "I'll be there at sunrise." "Looking forward to it, Miss Greene." With a final tip of his hat, Mason strode toward his horse, his tall frame silhouetted against the setting sun. Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, eyes closed. She would not starve. Not today, not tomorrow. It was a start. The next morning came too quickly and not soon enough. Margaret had spent the night mending her best dress, which wasn't saying much, and gathering her few belongings. The walk to the Reid Ranch took nearly an hour, each step kicking up dust from the dry Colorado earth. Mason's ranch sprawled across the landscape, modest compared to some, but well-maintained. A 2-story farmhouse stood proudly at its center, surrounded by various outbuildings and corrals. Cattle dotted the distant pastures, and the smell of horses and hay filled the air. As Margaret approached, she saw Mason emerging from the barn, sleeves rolled up and forearms glistening with sweat despite the early hour. He noticed her immediately, raising a hand in greeting. "You made it," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. "I said I would," Margaret replied, squaring her shoulders despite her exhaustion. "That you did." Mason led her toward the house. "Mrs. Potts is inside preparing breakfast. You'll meet her first, then we'll get you settled." Mrs. Potts turned out to be a plump, gray-haired woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She looked Margaret up and down, clucking her tongue. "Lord have mercy, child. You're nothing but skin and bones. Sit down before you fall down." Before Margaret could protest, she found herself seated at a wooden table with a plate piled high with eggs, bacon, and biscuits. The smell alone made her dizzy with hunger, but she forced herself to eat slowly, maintaining what dignity she had left. Mrs. Potts will show you your duties, Mason explained, pouring himself coffee. It's mostly cooking, cleaning, and helping with the household accounts. I understand you're educated? Margaret nodded, swallowing a bite of biscuit. My father was a schoolteacher before he passed. He insisted I learn my letters and figures. Good, that'll come in handy. Mason drained his coffee and stood. I've got work to attend to. I'll leave you ladies to get acquainted. After he left, Mrs. Potts sat across from Margaret with her own cup of coffee. He's a good man, Mr. Reid. Works harder than any 3 men combined. He seems kind, Margaret offered cautiously. Mrs. Potts snorted. Kind doesn't begin to cover it. That man works from dawn till dusk, then some. Took over this place after his pa died 5 years back. Been building it up ever since. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. And don't you worry about impropriety. My quarters are just down the hall from yours, and Mr. Reid's reputation is spotless. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. I wasn't concerned about that. Sure you weren't, dearie, Mrs. Potts winked. Now finish your breakfast. We've got work to do. The next few weeks passed in a blur of new routines. Margaret's duties were exactly as Mason had described, cooking alongside Mrs. Potts, cleaning the main house, and helping with the ranch accounts. The work was hard but satisfying, and for the first time in months, she went to bed with a full stomach each night. As her strength returned, so did her spirit. The hollow look in her eyes gradually gave way to something brighter, more alive. She found herself humming as she worked, an old habit she thought she'd lost along with Thomas. Mason was rarely in the house, spending his days out on the range with his small crew of cowboys. When their paths did cross, he was unfailingly polite, asking after her comfort and seeming genuinely pleased with her work. Sometimes she would catch him watching her with an unreadable expression, but he would quickly look away when she noticed. One evening, about a month after Margaret had started working at the ranch, she was balancing the ledgers in the study when Mason entered, looking more exhausted than usual. Still working? He asked, removing his hat. Margaret gestured to the open books. Just finishing up. There was a discrepancy in the cattle feed purchases that I wanted to resolve. Mason moved behind her to look over her shoulder, his presence warm and solid. She caught the scent of leather, horse, and something uniquely him. You've got a good head for numbers, he observed, studying her neat columns of figures. Thomas was a lucky man. The mention of her late husband sent a pang through Margaret's chest. He always said so, she replied softly. Mason straightened, clearing his throat. I've been meaning to talk to you about something, Miss Greene. Margaret, she corrected him. After a month of living under your roof, I think we can dispense with the formalities. A smile touched his lips. Margaret then, and I'm Mason. She closed the ledger, giving him her full attention. What did you want to discuss? I've got a problem, he began, moving to sit across from her. The town's growing. The railroad's coming through next year. There's opportunity here, but I'm stretched thin as it is. Margaret waited, unsure where this was leading. I've been offered the mail contract, Mason continued. Good money, regular income to supplement the ranch. But I can't manage it myself, not with everything else. Couldn't you hire someone? Margaret suggested. Mason shook his head. Trust is hard to come by, and the mail contract requires it, which is why I'm wondering if you'd consider taking it on. Margaret blinked in surprise. Me? I don't know the first thing about delivering mail. You're organized, reliable, and good with people. The rest can be learned. Mason leaned forward. It would mean additional pay, of course. The offer was tempting. The extra money would help her pay down Thomas's debts faster, maybe even save something for herself. I'd need to think about it. Mason nodded. Of course. Take your time. He stood, placing his hat back on his head. Good night, Margaret. Good night, Mason. After he left, Margaret remained at the desk, mind racing. The job would mean more independence, more security. But it would also mean less time at the ranch, less time with... She cut that thought off abruptly. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. The next morning, she gave Mason her answer over breakfast. I'll take the mail contract. His face broke into a genuine smile that transformed his features, making him look younger, less careworn. You won't regret it. I better not, she teased, surprising herself with the lightness in her voice. 2 days later, Mason drove Margaret into town in his wagon to introduce her to the postmaster, a bespectacled man named Harold Jenkins. Miss Greene will be handling the Reid Ranch's portion of the mail contract, Mason explained. Jenkins peered at Margaret over his glasses. A woman mail carrier? That's unusual. So is a female ranch accountant, Margaret replied smoothly. Yet the books balance all the same. Jenkins chuckled. Fair enough. Let me show you the routes and procedures. The mail route would require Margaret to make deliveries 3 times a week to the outlying farms and ranches. Mason provided her with a sturdy mare named Penny and a small cart for the mail bags. She's gentle but sure-footed, Mason said, patting the horse's neck. She'll get you where you need to go. Margaret stroked Penny's soft nose. She's beautiful. Thank you. Just taking care of my investment, Mason replied, but the warmth in his eyes belied the businesslike words. Margaret's first solo mail run came the following Monday. She set out just after dawn, the mail bags securely stowed in the cart. The route took her to 6 different properties, the furthest being nearly 10 miles from town. The work was more physically demanding than she'd anticipated. By the time she returned to the ranch that evening, her back ached and her hands were blistered from the reins. But there was also a satisfaction in it, a sense of accomplishment that had been missing from her life for too long. How was it? Mason asked when she trudged into the kitchen, where he sat drinking coffee with Mrs. Potts. Exhausting, Margaret admitted, sinking into a chair. But good. Mrs. Potts immediately began fussing, bringing Margaret a plate of stew and hot biscuits. You need to eat, child. You're working too hard. Says the woman who hasn't taken a day off in 20 years, Mason teased the older woman, who swatted at him affectionately. That's different. I'm built sturdy, like a good workhorse. This one's delicate. Margaret bristled at that. I'm stronger than I look. Mason's eyes met hers across the table. No one's doubting that, Margaret. The sincerity in his voice made something flutter in her chest, a sensation she quickly tamped down. She couldn't afford to feel such things, not when she was finally getting back on her feet. The weeks turned into months. Margaret settled into her dual roles at the ranch and as mail carrier with determined efficiency. Her body grew stronger, her skin tanned from the hours in the sun. The hollow look that had haunted her eyes disappeared completely, replaced by a quiet confidence. Mason, meanwhile, seemed to be working even harder than before. He was often gone before dawn and returned after dark, collapsing into bed only to rise and do it all again the next day. Sometimes he disappeared for days at a time, returning dusty and exhausted from cattle drives or business in neighboring towns. He's running himself into the ground, Mrs. Potts confided one evening as they prepared dinner. Always been that way, but it's worse lately. The ranch seems to be doing well, Margaret observed, kneading bread dough with practiced movements. It is, thanks in no small part to your work with the books, but that boy's got ambition. Mrs. Potts lowered her voice. Word is, he's taken on work at the new sawmill, too, supervising the night shift. Margaret's hands stilled. 3 jobs, the ranch, the mail contract, and now the sawmill? That's too much for any man. Mrs. Potts shrugged. Try telling him that. Stubborn as a mule, that one. When Mason finally trudged in that night, long after they had given up waiting dinner for him, Margaret was still awake, sitting by the fire in the main room with a book. You're up late, he said, surprise evident in his voice. And you're working too much, she replied, setting her book aside. The sawmill, Mason? Really? He sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. Mrs. Potts talks too much. She's worried about you. So am I. Mason dropped into the chair opposite her, the firelight casting shadows across his face. It's temporary, just until I've saved enough. Enough for what? He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. For the future. What future is worth working yourself to death for? His eyes met hers, something intense and unspoken passing between them. A better one. Before she could press further, he stood abruptly. I should get some sleep. Early start tomorrow. Mason, Margaret called as he reached the doorway. He paused, not turning. Whatever you're working toward, I hope it's worth it. It is, he said softly. Good night, Margaret. The next morning, He was gone before she woke, leaving only a note saying he'd be gone for 3 days on business in Denver. Margaret found herself unreasonably annoyed by his absence, which only irritated her further. She had no claim on his time or attention. She threw herself into her own work with renewed vigor. The mail route was becoming more demanding as more settlers arrived in the area, and the ranch accounts needed careful attention as Mason expanded his operations. On her mail run that Wednesday, Margaret delivered a package to the Johnson farm, where Mrs. Johnson insisted she stay for tea. "You're looking well," the older woman observed, pouring steaming liquid into chipped cups. "Ranch life agrees with you." "The work is good," Margaret replied diplomatically. Mrs. Johnson's eyes twinkled. "And I imagine working for a handsome man like Mason Reid doesn't hurt." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Mr. Reid is my employer, nothing more." "If you say so, dear, though half the unmarried women in the county would give their eye teeth to be in your position." "I'm a widow, Mrs. Johnson. I'm not looking for romance." The older woman patted her hand. "The heart doesn't always consult with the head before it decides what it wants." Margaret changed the subject, but Mrs. Johnson's words stayed with her as she completed her route. By the time she returned to the ranch, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. As she approached the house, she was surprised to see Mason's horse in the corral. He wasn't due back until tomorrow. Concern quickened her steps. She found him in the study, slumped over the desk, fast asleep. Papers were scattered around him, and an empty coffee cup sat at his elbow. In sleep, the lines of worry that had become permanent fixtures on his face were smoothed away, making him look younger, vulnerable. Margaret hesitated, then gently touched his shoulder. "Mason." He jerked awake, disoriented for a moment, before his eyes focused on her. "Margaret, what time is it?" "Nearly sunset. You're back early." He straightened, rolling his shoulders to work out the stiffness. "Finished my business sooner than expected. Thought I'd catch up on some paperwork." "By falling asleep on it?" She raised an eyebrow. A rueful smile touched his lips. "Not the most efficient method, I'll admit." "When was the last time you had a proper meal, or a full night's sleep?" Margaret crossed her arms. "I don't remember," he admitted, "but I'm fine." "You're not fine, you're exhausted." Margaret made a decision. "Go wash up. I'm making you dinner, and then you're going to bed. The paperwork will still be here tomorrow." Mason looked like he might argue, then seemed to think better of it. "Yes, madam." While he went to clean up, Margaret headed to the kitchen. Mrs. Potts had already retired for the evening, so Margaret set about preparing a simple but hearty meal beef stew that had been simmering all day, fresh bread, and apple pie that Mrs. Potts had baked that morning. Mason reappeared looking marginally more alert, his hair damp from washing and his shirt clean. He sat at the kitchen table while Margaret served the food. "You didn't have to do this," he said, though his eyes lit up at the sight of the meal. "Consider it self-preservation. If you work yourself to death, where does that leave me?" She meant it as a joke, but it came out more vulnerable than she intended. Mason looked up sharply. "You'd be fine. The ranch would go to you and Mrs. Potts." Margaret stared at him, stunned. "What are you talking about?" "My will. I updated it last month. If anything happens to me, the ranch goes to you both." He said it so matter-of-factly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Mason, I can't accept that." "We're not family. Aren't you?" He held her gaze steadily. "You and Mrs. Potts are the closest thing to family I've got. Who else would I leave it to?" Margaret sat heavily in the chair across from him, at a loss for words. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just eat before the food gets cold." He picked up his spoon, effectively ending the conversation. They ate in silence for a while, Margaret's mind whirling. Finally, she spoke again. "Why 3 jobs, Mason? What are you saving for that's so important?" He set down his spoon, considering her for a long moment. "You really want to know?" "I wouldn't ask if I didn't." Mason took a deep breath. "I'm trying to buy out the Benson property to the north. Old man Benson's moving back east to live with his daughter, and he's selling up. His land connects to mine, has its own water source, and would nearly double my grazing capacity." "That would be a significant expansion," Margaret acknowledged. "It would secure the ranch's future, Make it truly viable in the long term. His eyes took on that intensity she'd seen before. But Benson wants cash, and a lot of it, hence the extra jobs. Margaret considered this. Is that why you offered to buy my husband's land as well? Mason nodded. Partly, but also because I could see you were struggling. His expression softened. I couldn't stand seeing you waste away, Margaret. The simple honesty of his words touched her deeply. So, you created a job for me. No, he shook his head firmly. I offered you a position I genuinely needed filled. The fact that it helped you too was a happy coincidence. Margaret wasn't entirely convinced, but she let it go. And the mail contract, the sawmill. The mail contract is good business, and I did need help with it. The sawmill is temporary, just until I've saved enough for Benson's land. He pushed his empty plate away. Another month, maybe 2, and I'll have it. At what cost? Your health? Your life? Margaret leaned forward. Mason, you can't keep going like this. I have to, he said simply. It's important. Why? Why is expanding the ranch so important that you'd work yourself to death for it? Mason was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. Because I need to know that I've built something that will last, something I can pass on. His eyes met hers, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before, something that could support a family. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken words. Margaret felt her heart beating faster. You don't have a family, she said softly. Not yet. His gaze was steady, unwavering. Before Margaret could respond, the moment was broken by the sound of horses approaching. Mason rose, tension visible in his shoulders. I'm not expecting anyone, he said, moving to the window. His expression darkened. Stay here. He grabbed his rifle from where it hung by the door and stepped outside. Margaret, ignoring his instruction, followed him onto the porch. 3 riders had entered the yard, their faces obscured by the gathering darkness. Mason stood tall, rifle not quite aimed, but ready. State your business, he called out. The lead rider raised his hands to show he was unarmed. Mason Reid, name's Michael Turner. I work for the bank in Denver. Mason didn't lower his rifle. Bank's closed at this hour. Whatever business you have can wait till morning. Turner dismounted slowly. I'm afraid it can't. I'm here about your loan application for the Benson property. Margaret glanced at Mason, whose jaw had tightened. What about it? It's been denied, Mr. Reid. The bank manager sent me to inform you personally, given the size of the transaction. Mason's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. I see. There is, however, an alternative proposition. Turner reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a document. A private investor is willing to front the money, with terms. What investor? What terms? Mason's voice was wary. Mr. George Hammond. He's recently arrived from San Francisco with significant capital to invest in the region. Margaret felt a chill at the name. George Hammond was notorious in these parts, a wealthy businessman who had been buying up properties all over the territory, often using questionable tactics. Hammond? Mason's grip tightened on his rifle. The same Hammond who forced the Wilsons off their land last spring? Turner shifted uncomfortably. Business is business, Mr. Reid. Mr. Hammond is offering to loan you the full amount for the Benson property, with 2 years to repay. At what interest? 15%. Mason laughed humorlessly. Highway robbery. It's the best offer you're likely to get. Banks aren't keen to loan on land these days, not with the economy the way it is. Mason was silent for a long moment. I'll think about it. Turner nodded, replacing the document in his saddlebag. Mr. Hammond will be in town for the next week. The offer stands until then. He tipped his hat. Evening, Mr. Reid, madam. The 3 riders departed, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Mason remained on the porch, staring after them, his expression unreadable in the darkness. Mason? Margaret stepped closer. What are you going to do? He sighed deeply. I don't know. Hammond's a vulture. If I take his money and can't repay, he'll take everything. He turned to face her, his eyes troubled. But if I don't, Benson will sell to someone else. And I might never get another chance at that land. Margaret touched his arm gently. Come inside, we'll figure it out. The next morning, Mason was gone again. A note left saying he'd ridden to see Benson to ask for more time. Margaret went about her duties with a distracted mind, worry for Mason overshadowing everything else. Mrs. Potts noticed her preoccupation. "Something on your mind, child?" Margaret hesitated, then explained about Hammond's offer and Mason's dilemma. The older woman's face darkened. "That Hammond is a snake, ruined plenty of good folks around here with his schemes. That's what I'm afraid of. Mason's working himself to the bone as it is. If he takes this loan, he might lose everything," Mrs. Potts finished grimly, "including this place." That evening, Margaret skipped dinner, taking Penny out for a ride instead. She needed to clear her head, to think. Without consciously deciding to, she found herself heading toward her old cabin, which she hadn't visited in months. The small structure looked even more dilapidated than she remembered, windows dusty and door hanging slightly askew. Margaret dismounted and entered cautiously, half expecting to find squatters or wildlife had taken up residence. But the cabin was empty, just as she'd left it. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners. Margaret moved to the fireplace, where a loose brick concealed her most precious possession, a locket containing a small portrait of her parents, the only thing of value she owned. As she retrieved it, her fingers brushed against something else, a folded piece of paper she'd forgotten about. Pulling it out, she unfolded it carefully. It was the deed to Thomas's land, the land Mason had offered to buy when they first met. Margaret stared at the document, an idea forming in her mind. Thomas's land wasn't large, but it was good grazing territory. As Mason had said, if she sold it to him, it wouldn't be enough for the Benson property, but it might help reduce how much he'd need to borrow from Hammond, if it came to that. With sudden determination, Margaret tucked both the locket and the deed into her pocket and remounted Penny. Night was falling as she rode back to the ranch, where she found Mason sitting on the porch steps, looking defeated. "Benson won't wait," he said without preamble when she approached. "Hammond's already made him an offer. I have 3 days to match it, or the land goes to Hammond." Margaret sat beside him on the steps. "How much are you short?" "About half. Even with everything I've saved from the 3 jobs, it's not enough." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I could take Hammond's loan and pray I can repay it before he takes the ranch, but it's too risky," Margaret finished for him. "What if we sold my husband's land? Would that help?" Mason looked at her in surprise. "Your land? Margaret, that's all you have left of Thomas." "It's just land, Mason. Thomas is gone, and no patch of dirt will bring him back." She pulled out the deed. "You said yourself it's good grazing territory. It must be worth something." Mason took the deed, studying it in the fading light. "It would help, certainly, but I can't ask you to do this." "You're not asking. I'm offering." Margaret placed her hand over his. "You gave me a chance when I was starving, Mason. Let me help you now." His eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper. "Why would you do this for me?" Margaret took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Because I care about you. Because what you're building here matters. And because—" She faltered, then pressed on. "Because I think there might be a place for me in that future you're working toward." Mason's hand turned beneath hers, their fingers intertwining. "There always has been, Margaret, from the moment you walked onto this ranch." The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Mason lifted his free hand to her cheek, his touch gentle as a whisper. "I never dared hope you might feel the same way." "I didn't at first," Margaret admitted. "I was too focused on survival, on not being hungry anymore. And now? Now I want more than just survival." She leaned slightly into his touch. "I want a life, a real one." Mason's eyes darkened. "With me?" "With you." The kiss, when it came, was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. Margaret answered by leaning closer, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they finally broke apart, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "We'll figure this out together," he promised. "The land, the future, all of it." "Together," Margaret agreed. The next morning, they rode into town together to see the bank manager. With Margaret's land deed added to Mason's savings, they were able to secure a much smaller loan from the bank at reasonable interest to make up the difference for Benson's property. Hammond won't be pleased, the bank manager warned as they signed the papers. Hammond can go to hell, Mason replied pleasantly, making Margaret stifle a laugh. As they left the bank, Mason suddenly stopped in the middle of the street, turning to face Margaret. "This isn't how I planned to do this," he said, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "I had a whole speech prepared for her when the time was right." "A speech for what?" Margaret asked, confused. To her astonishment, Mason dropped to one knee right there in the dusty street, taking her hand in his. "Margaret Greene, I've been working 3 jobs and running myself ragged, all so I could build something worthy of offering to you. I wanted to have it all perfect before I asked, but life doesn't work that way, does it?" Margaret's heart hammered in her chest as passers-by stopped to watch. "I love you," Mason continued, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "I think I've loved you since that first day, when you stood in your doorway too proud to accept charity, but brave enough to accept help. Will you marry me? Build this life with me? For real?" Tears sprang to Margaret's eyes. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes!" Mason rose, sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around, heedless of the townspeople watching and cheering. When he set her down, his smile was brighter than she'd ever seen it. "No more 3 jobs, Margaret stipulated, trying to look stern despite her joy. "I won't have my husband working himself to death." "Just the ranch," Mason agreed, kissing her again. "And maybe the mail contract, we make a good team there." "Deal." Margaret sealed it with another kiss, no longer caring who was watching. They were married 2 weeks later, in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Mrs. Potts crying happy tears and half the county in attendance. That same day, Mason finalized the purchase of the Benson property, nearly doubling the size of what was now their ranch. "To the future," Mason toasted that night, when they were finally alone in what was now their bedroom. "Our future," Margaret corrected, raising her glass to his. As fall turned to winter, Margaret found herself happier than she'd ever been. The ranch thrived under their joint care, with Margaret handling the books and the mail route while Mason managed the cattle and the land. They made a formidable team, each complementing the other's strengths. Word came that Hammond had left the territory, having found easier targets elsewhere. The town continued to grow, and with the coming of the railroad the following spring, prosperity seemed assured. One crisp autumn morning, a year after they had married, Margaret woke early, slipping out of bed without waking Mason. She padded to the window, watching the sun rise over what was now Reid Ranch, their ranch. A pair of strong arms encircled her from behind, and Mason's chin rested on top of her head. "You're up early," he murmured, his voice still rough with sleep. "I was thinking," Margaret replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "About what?" She turned in his arms, looking up into the face she'd come to love so deeply. "About how far we've come. A year ago, I was wondering where my next meal would come from. Now you'll never have to wonder again," Mason finished, his eyes soft. "I promised you that, remember?" "I remember." Margaret took his hand and placed it on her stomach, which had just begun to show the slightest curve. "And soon, there will be one more person who'll never have to worry about going hungry." Mason's eyes widened, his gaze dropping to where his hand rested. "Margaret, are you saying—" She nodded, smiling through sudden tears. "In the spring, Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday." With a whoop of joy, Mason lifted her off her feet, spinning her around just as he had the day in town when she'd agreed to marry him. His laughter, unrestrained and full of wonder, was the sweetest sound Margaret had ever heard. "A baby," he marveled, setting her gently back on her feet. "Our baby?" "The first of many, if you have your way," Margaret teased, knowing how Mason dreamed of a house full of children. "Only if you want that too," he said, suddenly serious. "You're everything to me, Margaret. You and our child. The ranch, the land. None of it means anything without you. I want it all." "Mason," she assured him, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. "The land, the house full of children, the life we're building. Everything." As Mason held her close, his heartbeat strong and steady against her cheek, Margaret thought of how far they'd both come. From a starving widow and an overworked rancher to partners in every sense, building a legacy that would outlast them both. Outside the window, the sun rose fully over their expanded property, golden light spilling across the land they'd fought so hard to secure. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully, and smoke rose from the bunkhouse where their small crew of hands was starting the day. "I love you, Margaret Reed," Mason whispered against her hair. "And I love you," she replied, knowing with bone-deep certainty that she would never again know hunger, not for food, not for security, and certainly not for love. That spring, Margaret gave birth to a healthy baby boy they named James Thomas Reed. Mrs. Potts declared him the most beautiful baby she'd ever seen, and Mason couldn't stop grinning for days. As Margaret nursed their son in the rocking chair Mason had crafted with his own hands, she looked up to find her husband watching them from the doorway, his expression one of perfect contentment. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. "That I'm the luckiest man alive." Mason crossed the room to kneel beside her chair, one hand gently stroking their son's downy head. "That everything I worked for, every extra hour and every aching muscle, was worth it for this moment." Margaret smiled, leaning down to kiss him. "No more 3 jobs, though." "No need," Mason agreed. "The ranch is doing better than I ever dreamed possible." It was true. With the railroad's arrival, they'd secured contracts to supply beef to markets as far away as Denver and Kansas City. The mail route had expanded as well, requiring them to hire 2 additional carriers to cover all the new settlements springing up along the railway. "I was thinking," Mason said, rising to perch on the arm of her rocking chair, "about building onto the house, adding a nursery wing, maybe a proper library for all your books." Ambitious," Margaret teased. "Planning for more children already?" Mason's grin was boyish. "Maybe, if my wife is amenable." "Your wife thinks that sounds wonderful," Margaret replied, gazing down at their sleeping son. "But perhaps we should wait until this one is sleeping through the night before we start planning the next." Sensible as always, Mason brushed a kiss against her temple. As their son grew, so did the ranch and their family. 2 years after James came, a daughter, Grace, with her mother's green eyes and her father's determined spirit. Then another son, William, followed by twins, Emma and Eliza, who kept the entire household on their toes with their mischief. The years passed in a blur of growth and change. The town of Whispering Pines became a proper city, with a school where their children learned their letters, a church where they said their prayers, and a community that supported each other through good times and bad. Mason never again had to work 3 jobs, though he never lost his work ethic. The ranch prospered under their joint management, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. They added orchards and crop fields, diversifying beyond cattle to ensure they could weather any market fluctuations. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Mason surprised Margaret with a trip to San Francisco, her first journey beyond Colorado. They stayed in a grand hotel, attended the opera, and walked along the bay hand in hand like newlyweds. "Do you ever regret it?" Mason asked one evening as they watched the sunset from their hotel balcony. "Selling Thomas's land? Tying your fate to mine and the ranch?" Margaret turned to look at him, this man who had saved her from starvation and then stolen her heart. The years had added silver to his hair and lines around his eyes, but he was more handsome to her now than ever before. "Not for a single moment," she replied truthfully. "That land was just soil and rock. What we've built together is a life." Mason pulled her close, his arms still strong despite the passing years. "You saved me too, you know. Before you came, I was just working to work, building something with no real purpose. You gave it all meaning." As they stood together watching the sun sink into the Pacific, Margaret thought of that gaunt, desperate woman who had stared back at her from a cracked mirror so many years ago. How far she had come from those hungry days, not just in security and comfort, but in love and purpose. "We saved each other," she said simply, and knew it was true. When they returned home, their children and grandchildren greeted them with a surprise anniversary celebration at the ranch. James, now a grown man with a family of his own, had managed everything perfectly in their absence. Grace, training to be a doctor in Denver, had returned home specially for the occasion. William, who had his father's head for business, presented them with the ranch's best quarterly accounts ever, and the twins, now beautiful young women of 18, had organized the entire party down to the last detail. As Margaret looked around at the home and family they had built together, she caught Mason's eye across the room. Even after all these years, just the sight of him made her heart beat faster. He winked at her, raising his glass in a silent toast that needed no words. Later that night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Mason traced lazy patterns on her skin with his fingertips. 20 years, he mused. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you first walked onto this ranch. And sometimes it feels like I've always been here, Margaret replied, nestling closer to his warmth. Like everything before was just preparing me for this life. Even the hungry times? Mason asked softly. Even those, Margaret nodded against his chest. They taught me to appreciate every meal, every moment of security. To never take any of this for granted. Mason's arms tightened around her. I promised you'd never go hungry again. Have I kept that promise? Margaret raised herself up on one elbow to look into his beloved face. In every way that matters. Food, yes, but also love, purpose, family. You filled my life to overflowing, Mason Reid. And you filled mine, he whispered, pulling her down for a kiss that held all the passion and tenderness of their 20 years together, and the promise of many more to come. Outside their window, the vast Colorado sky sparkled with stars above the land they'd fought for and tended together. The ranch slept peacefully around them, their legacy, their home, the physical manifestation of a promise kept. Margaret had once been a woman who didn't know where her next meal would come from. Now she was the matriarch of a thriving ranch, mother to 5, grandmother to 7, with another on the way, and wife to a man who had worked 3 jobs just to ensure she would never know hunger again. As she drifted to sleep in Mason's arms, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that some forms of hunger, the hunger for love, for family, for purpose, had been satisfied beyond her wildest dreams, and that was the greatest feast of all.